Hello and welcome to Built Environment Matters, a monthly podcast brought to you by Bryden Wood, an international company of technologists, designers, architects, engineers and analysts working for a better built environment. Bryden Wood believe in design to value, to cut carbon, drive efficiency, save time, make beautiful places and build a better future.
Hi all, and welcome to this edition of Built Environment Matters, the Bryden Wood podcast. I'm your host, Jamie Johnston, Head of Global Systems. This episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Kirsty Gogan, who is the founder, along with Eric Ingersoll, and managing partner of Terra Praxis, which is a non-profit focused on developing climate-scale solutions for our most difficult to decarbonise sectors, including coal and liquid fuels. Kirsty is also managing partner of Lucid Catalyst, a highly specialised international consultancy focused on large-scale, affordable, market-based decarbonisation of the global economy. Kirsty's voluntary work includes having co-founded Energy for Humanity. She serves on the UK government's Nuclear Innovation Research Advisory Board, as well as on the board of US NGO Nuclear Innovation Alliance and the French NGO Voices for Nuclear. The US National Academies of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine has appointed her to serve on a new committee to identify opportunities for barriers to the commercialisation of new and advanced nuclear energy technologies over the next 30 years. So, Kirsty, thanks for joining us.
Great to be here, Jamie. Thanks for having me on.
That's an incredible CV, actually, isn't it? When you just list those things. I mean, it takes a while, but they're all fantastic things to mention. You've got an incredible background. So I'm sure we'll cover some of that in more detail. I said right at the top, you're the founder and managing partner of Terra Praxis. Can you tell us more about Terra Praxis and your history, a bit about Eric and how this came about?
Oh, yeah, thanks. Well, I'm super lucky, really, to be working with Eric Ingersoll. He's been my business partner now for several years at Lucid Catalyst, and Terra Praxis is a relatively new venture, just over a year old. But working with Eric sort of more broadly to unleash the creativity, the determination that we need to tackle the hardest parts of the decarbonisation challenge has just been a total highlight, really, of my career. And Terra Praxis we founded to really sort of start assembling solutions for these really tough to decarbonise parts of the economy and design and then execute really kind of complex, high leverage strategies that are aimed at sort of inspiring and then also mobilising leaders across multiple sectors to actually initiate action themselves, and then hopefully they'll sustain their own momentum. So we can tell you about some of those projects that we're working on, including with you now, Jamie, as well, and how we hope that they really could transform our prospects for avoiding catastrophic climate impacts. And so it gives me hope, really.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We've obviously talked a lot about this. Nuclear seems to get a sort of very much a knee-jerk reaction from people. I think there's a lot of preconceptions around it. The language is definitely changing. Even the last couple of months, we've seen some of the messaging start to shift. But one of the things we found fascinating is when you actually started to explain what these new advanced heat sources are like, why they're more passive, why everyone's misconceptions around nuclear aren't necessarily true. So perhaps you can sort of explain a bit about some of those technologies.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? There's such a big gap between the fact that it's consistently identified as being really necessary in our climate mitigation roadmaps by everyone from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the International Energy Agency, the European Commission, and then the perception, which is a bit outdated, really, especially when you do start to look at these new technologies. I'm an environmentalist who spent my whole career working on sustainability issues and, including as a civil servant for Deputy Prime Minister John Prescott, as an activist planting forests, and as even a consultant for big corporations like Ben & Jerry's and Greenpeace. And I have to confess that as an environmentalist, I was basically by default anti-nuclear. And that changed when, well, first of all, I was given a book actually as a wedding present by my now husband's aunt, which I really recommend to anybody. It's called Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air by Professor Sir David Mackay. And he number crunches through what it would take for the UK to meet its climate targets with existing technologies. And reading that book, I firstly realised that it was going to be really, really tough to get to zero emissions just with renewables alone. And, we'd have to make really tough choices about how to use our land and so on. But also that basically I really realised that I wasn't educated about nuclear, and I'd made a whole bunch of wrong assumptions based on old ideas that didn't really hold water. So I started reading into it more and started my journey, and here I am now really advocating strongly for nuclear to play a big role. And particularly when you look at the small modular reactors and the advanced heat sources, I think that will really help convince any of the remaining skeptics. And that's partly because they're designed to be smaller manufactured products that can be largely made in factories. And that's really a big contrast with the sort of Olympic scale construction projects that take a decade to build and cost 20 billion quid. You know, it's easier to finance a 1 billion or 2 billion pound plant than a 20 billion pound plant, and it's much better for communities to have the plant being quickly assembled on site rather than having years of disruption and dust and noise associated with a big construction project. But ultimately, I think the real turning point is going to come when more people realise that these technologies, big and small, are actually really versatile. They do a lot more than just deliver always-on electricity. They can operate really flexibly to complement wind and solar. And most importantly, they can produce heat. And that emissions-free heat turns out to be really, really useful for all kinds of things, including making hydrogen or supplying heat directly to homes and businesses, or desalinating water and so on. So actually, when you look beyond electricity, which is only 20% of our energy use, to the other 80% of our energy use, then it turns out nuclear technologies can actually be incredibly useful. So that's, I think, why you're starting to notice that big change, Jamie, in the sort of discourse and the language that's being used. More and more people are realising we're just not bending the curve on emissions. We're going to have to diversify our strategies. And it turns out we do have this other tool available to us that could be really useful.
Yeah, I think one of the light bulb moments for me, I saw someone did a presentation on sort of all energy sources available to humankind, and solar's massive. You're going, well, there we go, slam dunk. They're going, but the density is so low that to harness enough energy, you need to build a solar farm the size of Wales to power the UK and things. So there's
Exactly.
the kind of density, there's the dispatch power that you can't get it consistently enough, and all the easy sites have been nabbed, so it's getting progressively hard to do some of those renewables. So yeah, Martin Wood talked a bit about this on the last podcast. He's saying it's like the vaccines race. Yes, obviously we need solar and wind, but to only rely on them and not to be exploring these other technologies, you're missing a massive trick. And if you can't do it with wind and solar, you go, flip it, now we should have been doing a lot more on nuclear. So yeah, his view is, we need to lean into all of these technologies. And if we find we don't need nuclear in 30 years, fantastic. But to not have it in our toolbox now would be a huge mistake.
I think that's right. I think what's happening is that we're reevaluating the perceived risks of nuclear against the risks of failing to decarbonise. And when you look at those macro trends of sort of you start building out wind and solar and everything's going brilliantly, it looks like you're on a kind of hockey stick curve, that the upward trajectory of deployment is just going to keep on going and going. And that's often what is included in the energy systems modelling. It's just a total hockey stick. And actually what happens is that you use those early sites that you're building on are the easier sites. They've got maybe access to transmission. They're really well suited to accommodate those wind and solar projects. But the more and more you build, the harder and harder it gets. And then actually what happens is the hockey stick curve turns into an S-shaped curve. And we're finding that in many places, this macro trend of encountering more and more public resistance to building out more and more infrastructure. And that's before we start talking about transmission, which, is really hard to build because it's really difficult to make the case that people will benefit directly from jobs and so on associated with transmission build. So when you start looking at the land use issues, you start to realise that actually the net zero transition is going to require a large amount of new infrastructure to be built. And there's big questions about where it can be built. And frankly, it doesn't matter how cheap it is if you can't build it.
Yeah, absolutely. Which kind of leads us on to the repowering coal project that we're working on with you guys. So looking at how you can repurpose some of the existing infrastructure and decarbonise. Perhaps you can explain a bit more about that project.
Yeah, it was really working on the risks issue, actually, that's led us to really start thinking that actually the opportunity to repower existing coal plants is more than an interesting idea. It might be really necessary. So the Net Zero America report that was produced by Princeton recently suggested that the low renewable scenario would need the US grid to double or triple in size, which, as we've just been discussing, it seems extremely unlikely, very high risk strategy. But if you were to be able to reuse all of the existing thermal sites, if you could repower all of the existing coal plants in the United States, you could reduce the amount of new transmission bills by 40%. So that is a sort of radical de-risking of our net zero transition. And so it's a big opportunity to essentially what we're proposing to do, Jamie, is co-locate one of these advanced heat sources next to existing coal plants, decommission the coal boiler, but keep the rest of the plant operating, so the steam turbine, the power island, and the existing transmission, and working with you on developing a really scalable building system that can be configured to meet any kind of site or plant requirements and accommodate a range of different heat sources in a highly automated design, manufacture and assembly approach, could actually deliver incredibly low costs and achieve the sort of rates of deployment and scale that we need to fully decarbonise the 2 terawatts of coal that's still projected to be operating in the world today.
I mean, it protects the livelihoods, where these plants are often situated. The entire town is there to support the plant. So if you switch the plant off, suddenly you've got massive political problems, you've got unemployment rates and things. The idea that you can reuse all of that existing infrastructure, all of that kind of economic infrastructure, and just literally swap out the heat source, you go, it's so obvious, it sounds so plausible, so doable, and yeah, the impact you'd have would be vast, wouldn't it?
It really would, yeah. I mean, it's unforgivably unrealistic, really, to just think that we're going to abandon those assets. You know, even in countries with old coal, like in the United States and Canada and in Europe, it's really, really tough to shut down these coal plants because you're right, it is devastating, the impact on communities when you close down those plants. There's 260 gigawatts of operating coal still even in the United States. And the prospect of abandoning those assets is creating a total political deadlock on President Biden's climate plan. So this is a really important opportunity, political opportunity, to create bipartisan support for climate action in a way that actually has climate justice at its heart as well. Because as you say, it does then mean you can maintain those jobs, the socioeconomic benefits, the tax revenues in those communities. And actually what's really interesting is that the plants, when they're repowered with these heat sources, will likely run at a much higher capacity factor than they currently do today, at a lower cost, making the plants even more profitable than they were before. And then also with potential to add additional value services, like, for example, carbon removal, atmospheric carbon removal, with the cooling towers, the production of hydrogen. So you end up potentially creating real clean energy hubs in these communities that will operate now for decades to come. So it's gaining a lot of traction in the US. And we'd expect that it will do the same elsewhere in the world, where the vast majority of the global coal fleet is actually only around 14 years old or less than 14 years old. So there's $1 trillion of unrecovered capital in that global coal fleet. And those plants are providing reliable electricity to citizens that need it. So, maintaining that energy is going to be really important as well for not only for prosperity and economic growth in those parts of the world, Asia, China, India, Africa, but actually also that energy is necessary for climate resilience as well, for resilience against climate impacts that these communities are already feeling.
Can you just unpack some of those numbers? I love the statistics around this, but I mean, the scale of how many of these plants there are, the fact that there's more being built as we speak, the fact that there's, the existing ones are nowhere near end of life, and therefore it makes no financial sense to switch them off, and the sort of percentage of the climate change targets we need to hit that could be addressed by this one initiative, it staggers me, some of the numbers that are attached to this. It's a huge problem, but the opportunity is absolutely vast, isn't it?
It is. It's astonishing. I mean, we had 2 gigawatts of coal operating in the UK yesterday. Post-COVID, coal is surging to its highest ever level. And it's partly as a result of the energy crisis that, of course, we're all feeling, where we're seeing gas prices now spiking to, very, very high levels, and security of supply issues being felt around the world after an unusually cold summer and a still and cloudy summer as well. So we didn't see renewables generating as much as we would have liked. So that, combined with the fact that the global economic recovery is a very energy intensive process, and therefore we have countries like China, like India, African countries, Asian countries, burning coal in order to start reviving their economies and do the sort of post-pandemic recovery. And the bottom line is that, we often think, oh, it's nuclear versus renewables or coal versus renewables. It's really not. You have to have that sort of reliable, always on electricity. So back to the numbers, Jamie, we're still expecting to see 2 terawatts of coal operating by mid-century, which just on its own would swallow up our entire remaining carbon budget. The coal-fired capacity that's used in the world today is emitting around 15 billion tonnes of carbon emissions per year, almost half of all of our carbon emissions. It's sort of quite astonishing, actually, the scale of it, because it's not just electricity generation. Of course, coal is contributing to our industrial emissions as well. More than half of the global fleet are very young assets, less than 14 years old. So retirement of that infrastructure seems highly unattractive and unrealistic as a prospect for most of those owners and investors.
Yeah, one of the things that Martin talked about when he came back from COP26 was that a lot of the demand projections are probably wrong. So I love that Factfulness, the Hans Rosling book, where it talks about the journey that countries go on from where they start. Everyone industrializes, their energy needs go up, etc., etc. We've got another 4 billion people on the way. So to think that we're not going to need vast amounts more power actually in the next couple of decades is completely wrong. So even if we could control it now, we haven't got a plan for that massive increase in population, and their energy demands are only going to increase over time.
Yeah, I mean, it is quite an interesting idea, this actually, that we really don't know what trajectory we're on. Because when you look at the current projections for our temperature increases based on the commitments that were made, for example, at COP26, for deforestation, methane emissions reduction, the updated nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, the International Energy Agency said, oh, well, we've put all that into our energy systems modeling. And the good news is we're now on a 1.8 degree trajectory based on if all of these commitments are met, which firstly is a really big caveat, right? Because, let's see all those commitments be met. But none of those projections include any increase in global energy access, any meaningful increase. And firstly, we hope that that's wrong, because 4 billion people lack access to enough electricity. Almost 1 billion people in the world lack access to any electricity at all today. That 850 million people without any access is projected to increase to 3 billion people without even a light bulb in their house by 2050. That is just astonishing. And it's, well, as we say, hopefully it's wrong. The question we need to be asking is where that energy is going to come from. Eric's done some analysis that suggests that if everyone in the world was to have access to the sort of median level of energy, which is equivalent to about sort of Czech Republic, which is about 4,000 kilowatt hours per person, compared to 15,000 in the US and 0 or very, very low in the majority of the world, we'd need to triple our global energy infrastructure to just bring everybody up to the average level. And that means bringing people down as well as up. So you're absolutely right, Jamie, that until we start really taking into account the rising global energy demand and build that into the heart of our climate mitigation strategies, so not only do we have to replace our entire global energy, fossil fuel-based energy infrastructure by 2050, not just electricity, but transport and industry as well, we're still looking at very high risks of very severe climate impacts.
Yeah, one of the things I absolutely love about working with you guys is, you are looking incredibly broadly. So as you say, it's not just repowering coal is one initiative, but you're also looking at oil and gas in shipping, aviation industry, all these other things. Perhaps you can explain some of the other initiatives that you guys are looking at, because it is an incredible roster of initiatives, all of which are probably needed to address the massive challenges we've got.
Yeah, we try and focus on the big ones, that's for sure. Coal is a big one, but yeah, oil and gas, they're big ones too. We use about 100 million barrels of oil per day right now, so it's big. And when you look at, all of the sort of projected energy use, IEA, EIA, DNV, BP, they're all still expecting more than half of our global energy to come from fossil fuels by mid-century. So that really puts us onto something that looks much more like a 3 to 4 degree trajectory of warming, which, is a really bad outcome. So yeah, we need really good answers for our coal, but also for our liquid fuels. And one of the things we've been looking at is very low cost, very large scale hydrogen production. And I'm sure you've heard about hydrogen as being an important decarbonisation tool, and that's because it has the potential to be an ingredient in clean drop-in substitute fuels. So we don't see hydrogen necessarily as being that useful as an end-use product, because it's quite difficult to store and transport and move around, and you'd have to invest a lot in new infrastructure for end users as well. But as an ingredient for ammonia, for example, which can be used as a marine shipping fuel, or synthetic hydrocarbons, that means you can use your existing storage, transport and end use infrastructure. You can use today's planes and ships and so on, and that starts to get really useful. But for hydrogen to be an ingredient in those fuels, it has to be really, really cheap, which means it has to be less than $1 a kilogram, which is way out of range for any of the prospects for renewables until 2050. And that's largely because, firstly, they're very dispersed, very dilute energy source. So, even if you build renewables in windy and sunny places and combine them to increase the capacity factors, you still have to pay for the transport of those fuels around the world, and you still get into high prices. But with these advanced heat sources, if you move into a shipyard-based manufacturing environment to make offshore production platforms, which are really akin to what the oil and gas industry uses today, these sort of large floating production platforms, then you can start to get into very, very low costs. And it's the same model, again, Jamie, as the repowering coal, which is figuring out how to make very high productivity manufactured based products in highly automated environments. And then, the opportunity to move away from sort of electricity generation, where you're tethered to a transmission system and the electricity market, towards a commodities-based system where essentially you're making a product that you can store and transport and export to global markets. Then you free up your siting opportunities too, and that's where the offshore siting opportunity really comes into its own, and it is extremely scalable as well.
Could you reappropriate some of the sort of petrochemical supply chain? So a bit like repowering coal, you repurpose a supply chain and say, stop doing oil and gas, we're now doing this other thing, because it feels like there must be some relevant skills that you could actually adopt and start to move into a different, better space.
Absolutely. I mean, the oil and gas industry is already operating at global scale. So we should be seeking to leverage as much of that skills and capability, but also their, existing infrastructure as much as possible. We have an analogy, the Impossible Burger analogy, that we like to use, which is, if you don't know, the Impossible Burger is a plant-based meat substitute that you can buy in any Burger King across America now, and it looks like a burger, it tastes like a burger, costs the same as a burger, and it doesn't require behavior change in order for it to be widely adopted. And we see that we need a lot of impossible burgers for climate. And essentially that's what these fuels are. These clean drop-in substitute fuels that can be produced at a cost which is comparable with the fossil fuels that we use today and has the same performance as the fossil fuels that we use today, but that can be distributed through all of the existing supply chain infrastructure. That's really an impossible burger. It doesn't require behavior change, and it doesn't require a huge amount of investment in associated infrastructure, which again, not only reduces the overall cost and therefore reduces the overall likelihood of us actually doing it, but it also reduces the risk, because you don't have to sequence a whole load of investment in order to make the product really work.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's been a sort of common theme over the last year on these podcasts of talking about the behavioural change that's needed for when we're typically talking about industrialised construction. It's always the cultural barriers that we discuss. It's never the technical things. So yeah, that's a fantastic point. If you don't have to change people's behavior, some of your problem just evaporates. You go, right, I don't have to, I've lowered the barrier to entry so much that it becomes, entirely sensible and just the right thing to do and an easy thing to do.
Yeah, it's really a kind of important operating principle for us, which is making this as sort of irresistible and easy as possible. Which means making it more profitable, making it a very straightforward decision for the investor. And whether you're sort of repurposing existing coal plants where you've got a kind of ready workforce that actually might be really interested in the prospect of having, another 60 years of operating a highly profitable plant, but without all of the pollution and the emissions associated with that, or an opportunity to repurpose all of our existing infrastructure, and frankly having guilt-free flying rather than sort of trying to guilt people into behavior change. People like junk food. Let them have junk food, let them fly on holiday, go with the grain of human behavior, and we're more likely to actually succeed because we don't have time on our side. The really important detail here is timescales. It's the 100 million barrels of oil scale, but we've also got 28 years to achieve this transition globally.
And presumably everyone who's in this space must be looking for some good news answers. No one's running a coal-powered plant and thinking, yeah, this is fine. This will be fine for another 30 years. So there must be, there's this moral shift. There's a big political shift. Obviously, the language is getting a lot easier around some of these things. So it feels like everything's at least pointing in the same direction. Having sort of talked about the doom and gloom earlier, it does feel like there is at least a greater acceptance that we have to do these things now.
Yeah, it's super interesting, isn't it? Because we started off by talking about how nuclear energy's been kind of dismissed or ignored or neglected in the discourse really until quite recently. And in some ways, that's given us this great opportunity to sort of discover a new tool. And if we can figure out ways of delivering it, like modernizing the delivery of that technology, working with organizations like yours that are kind of at the cutting edge of manufacturing and design and delivery, that can actually achieve the sort of scale and rates of deployment, the speed and the scale that's necessary within the climate context that we're operating, then all of a sudden you've got this kind of whole new avenue of potential, especially for these tough to decarbonize parts of the problem. Because again, the unique attributes of nuclear technology is not only does it make power, but it also makes heat. And when you combine heat and power, that's when you start to be able to really dig into these tough to decarbonize sectors: industrial heat, domestic heating, desalination, but of course then also, the big ones like fuels and repowering coal.
Yeah, it does feel like there's a sequence. A lot of these new technologies just need large amounts of clean heat and power. You go, if you can generate that, it unlocks all these other technologies. It feels like there's a sort of domino effect of, potentially you suddenly get this sort of exponential increase in adoption of these things, which is, potentially fantastic news.
It is. And we're starting to gain a lot of traction with these strategies. We're getting a lot of interest from investors, from governments, from policymakers, from other NGOs, and also customers. So airlines are really interested in the prospect of having clean drop-in substitute fuels that are comparable in price and performance to the fuels that they use today, because that's not on offer in the current sort of sustainable aviation fuel discourse. So that starts to become like a real prospect for them. And likewise for the oil majors and oil producing nations that are really starting to have to think about their transition strategies. I was at an oil and gas conference recently and watching the CEOs of one oil company after another saying even 2 years ago, we weren't under this kind of pressure. And now they really are. And I think it's because people around the world are already experiencing climate impacts, not just, in the poorer countries, but everywhere. And in Germany, there was the terrible floods this summer, the wildfires in the United States, starting to become real. And I think that's creating an appetite for new solutions. And our job is to be ready for them.
Absolutely. It's just changing tack slightly. So you were up at COP26 very recently. I heard very mixed reviews, but there was a lot of disappointment, I think, coming out of COP26 that things weren't accelerating as quickly. I'd like to get your view on what you saw, what you experienced, how your COP26 was, because obviously you had the event that we attended on repowering coal. So perhaps you can explain a bit more about that.
Yeah, is the cup only half full? Yeah, I mean, it's funny, a colleague of mine said, well, it's a bit like, having gone to New York last weekend and people saying, how was New York? Because there's so many things happening. It's such a huge event. There's tens of thousands of people. But yeah, I mean, broadly speaking, the expectations were, of course, they were high. In my experience, having been at each COP since Paris and COP21 in 2015, I found, two big changes. One was that the representation from the global south seems to really be increasing. And the global south is on the front line. It's almost like these are voices from the future that are already really exposed to climate impacts that are happening now. And because of the lack of access to energy in those countries, because they're poor and they lack access to energy that can help build their economies and build their infrastructure, they're much less resilient to those impacts. So there's a kind of combined demand for energy growth in those countries and decarbonisation, clean energy growth as well. So that was really striking. And, I think it's getting more and more difficult for the developed, the industrialised world that's contributed the sort of lion's share of historical emissions be so slow in decarbonising our own economies. And that in itself is opening real questions around, the social acceptability, frankly, of having this indulgent approach to, oh, I like this technology, but not that technology. How can we justify shutting down our existing nuclear plants, which provide around half of European clean energy, and replacing them with coal and gas? It's a very interesting shift, I think, that's happening in the discourse right now. And I think it's beginning to marginalise the traditional left, environmental anti-nukes. And actually the representation from nuclear at the COP was very strong. It was the strongest that I've seen, and the appetite for it was the strongest that I've seen. And I think, again, it comes back to the same themes that we've been discussing, Jamie, which is that we're not bending the curve on emissions. The emissions are continuing to rise year on year, despite 25 years of building political support for action on climate and having these climate conferences. There's a recognition that we have to do more, we have to diversify our strategies, and we also have to look beyond electricity and decarbonise other parts of the economy as well, and that nuclear could be really useful. So the big outcome for me at COP was the decision to have an annual holding to account rather than a 5-year accounting period. And that should hopefully start to build up the pressure, particularly on Europe and the United States and Canada, the wealthy world, to actually, demonstrate some progress.
Yeah, why we don't do it every year is beyond me anyway, given the urgency of this. Every year counts. And we've talked a bit on this podcast before about it feels like there was a few years where sustainability and climate crisis sort of dropped off the radar a little bit. And we sort of feels like we lost some ground there, and we're now desperately trying to catch up. And you go, we can't be, let's not give it another 5 years and see how we're getting on. I think you're right. It needs to be an annual thing now, doesn't it? And it needs to be, something that everyone's considering all the time.
Well, I found it really shocking that the pandemic was indetectable in terms of emissions. We had amongst the highest ever growth in emissions in 2019 and 2020 during the pandemic, even though it felt like the world economy sort of came to a stop in certain ways. It really didn't.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So what was that then? Because obviously, no one flew anywhere, but was it just the fact that data centers were at peak capacity because suddenly everyone was on Teams all the time, and so
still making stuff,
Yeah, lots and lots of Amazon deliveries and things as well. Presumably there was all those things, but
and I guess making steel and concrete, and construction was continuing in many places, and manufacturing was continuing. So which is largely invisible to lots of people. And this is one of the interesting things about this whole climate agenda, isn't it? That our own personal behaviour, of course, contributes to a certain extent, but actually it's the much larger sort of macro economy that's really driving very large amounts of the overall emissions.
Yeah, you're right. I think it is quite invisible to people, isn't it? So yeah, even if people are not flying as much and they're eating vegetarian food more often and things, you go, okay, that's all helpful, it's necessary, but yeah, it's a rounding error compared to these other big industries which are constantly running in the background. And yeah, I guess that's the stuff that people don't see, and that's why some of these technologies are absolutely vital, aren't they?
That's why the manufacturing approaches that you design at Bryden Wood are so interesting, because they have this opportunity for like a radical reduction in resource intensity and in overall life cycle in the production, in the materials and the equipment and the manufacturing of these.
Yeah, it does feel like that shift to these sort of smaller, more repeatable, more manufactured things has got to be the way forward. I mean, it's like, when you look at the scale of the sort of Hinkley Point and things, the scale of that biblical construction, how long it takes and how much it costs, you go, again, it's too slow. We need something that's much quicker, much more scalable, much more deployable, like now. Not 15 years or whenever Hinkley Point's going to be finished.
Yeah, so in the US, the Assistant Secretary Katie Huff, she said we've got to stop building airports and start building airplanes.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
Conscious of time, that's been one of the most interesting conversations I think we've had in this podcast, and it's been so rangy.
Gosh, what a compliment.
Well, from the implications of getting this wrong and it, us killing the planet, to the optimism around some of these technologies being just ready to, or nearly ready to deploy. Where do you sit? Are you generally optimistic? Are you generally still terrified? Do you think we're going to bail ourselves out of this issue? Because obviously the stakes are vast, aren't they?
They are, yeah. And my daughter will be the age that I am now in 2050. So, that sort of helps me realize it's not that far away. Sometimes timescales can feel quite abstract in the future, but they're really close. And we have to turn this around in a generation, basically. Our working generation has to turn this around. And half of the emissions that are in the atmosphere today were emitted in the last 30 years. So we have to really turn this tanker. And yeah, we have to think really big. And one of the big challenges I think we have is finance. So there's still a lot of prejudice against nuclear energy in the finance world. So the World Bank, for example, won't finance nuclear projects. The European Sustainable Finance Taxonomy has been considering for years now whether nuclear energy would qualify as green, despite all of the science telling us that it's actually the lowest carbon clean energy source that there is. So we do have big challenges ahead, but I really do think that the tide is turning on this. And as I say, our job is to anticipate that in 5 years from now or in 2 years from now, the urgency is only going to be greater. And we just need to be ready to have the finance, licensing, siting, public acceptability, supply chain strategies that are designed and ready to go, ready to roll out the door at global scale when the world is ready, which I think it will be very, very soon.
Yeah, I suppose if I look back on the last 20 years and think how many things in certainly technology and the way we deal with technology and retail, commerce, entertainment, all of these big sectors have been shifted fundamentally through some rapid adoption technology. So yeah, it does give you hope, I suppose, that in another 20 years, we'll be looking back and going, oh yeah, that's, we're much cleaner, greener. We've really got a handle on climate crisis, and the future might not be so bleak.
It does help working with Eric because he's incredibly imaginative and creative and talented, and he's sort of thinking at this global scale, which not many humans are able to do, I don't think. And that's the secret, isn't it? That we have to sort of surround ourselves by people who are just as motivated and bring many, many different talents and insights and capabilities to the team. It's in that collaboration that we might actually be, us humans, puny humans, we might actually be able to make it.
When I first met you a few years ago, I wasn't entirely sure why we were chatting, because I was thinking, we do some industrialized construction stuff. How can we possibly help with some of the big challenges that you were tackling? It seemed like we were in the margins, but actually, yeah, Repowering coal, it's a phenomenal project. We're really pleased to be a part of it. Yeah, desperately hope we can get it to work, because I was talking to Martin in the last podcast and saying it's probably the biggest value problem statement we've had. It's the biggest social impact we could potentially make through this initiative. So we're delighted to be part of it.
Oh, well, we're delighted that you're being part of it too, because I think what you bring is really the sort of solution for how we can actually design this to be delivered at the scale that's needed. It's a very unique proposition from Bryden Wood, and everybody who sees your work in our world is just astonished and amazed and says, well, we should be building all our buildings this way.
We definitely think so.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Well, thanks for partnering with us on this, and it's exciting. I think we're going to go from strength to strength.
Thanks ever so much for joining us. As I say, that's been a really, really fascinating conversation. Hopefully that's given everyone lots of optimism about the future and how we might actually tackle climate crisis. So I hope you found that as fascinating as I did. Thanks for listening, and please join us for the next episode of Built Environment Matters.
Thank you for listening to Built Environment Matters, a podcast brought to you by Bryden Wood. Listen and subscribe wherever you get your favourite podcast, and you can follow Bryden Wood on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Perfect.